Welcome to the University of Nottingham podcast.
In this podcast, we hear from Professor Richard King, who's just got back from the United States, where he was among the thousands gathered for Barack Obama's inauguration. He'll look at the role of the so-called old guard in the new dispensation.
Again, they're sending up flags for saying, negotiate with us, negotiate with us.
Life in America after George W. Bush.
Bush's leaving has caused problems for Jon Stewart and other comedians.
I was just going to get on to the Daily Show.
We'll go ahead.
And the future for Sarah Palin.
She's had her taste of national attention and it's tasted good, and she'll probably want to push it a little farther.
Well, I mean, I think starting obviously with the inauguration, you were there.
Yeah.
What was it like?
Well, in some ways, the newspaper and magazine reports got it pretty much right. I think it was beautiful weather, very cold. There was high spirits in the crowd, friendliness. Several times, two or three times I was walking along and somebody just started talking to me, often African American, which is unusual in general and in particular white and black. I also talked with friends who lived in D.C. who said that the kind of friendliness across racial lines was markedly different or had grown in the last few weeks. So there was a euphoria. I think part of that is explained by Washington is 75% African American, and I was struck. It was one of the real things I was struck by on the coverage, both nationally and locally, how much race suddenly is emphasized and focused on, whereas during the campaign it had been very, you can almost say, present by its absence. I mean, it was markedly avoided by the Obama campaign and him and all the way across the board. So there was a real flip-flop, I think, in the emphasis.
Obviously, a significant moment in US and world history.
Yeah.
Did that sense of occasion come through for you?
Yeah, very much. Both me personally, and I think it would be accentuated because I had come from across the Atlantic. There were Brits interviewed on television. People, a couple of German and their families had come. So it had an international cast too. But I think there was very much a sense of the people there being both, not just the racial dimension, but a national, and for many people there, an international dimension to it.
The inauguration aside now, it's very much down to business, and it was quite striking how quickly he did get down to business. Guantanamo Bay, were you surprised at the speed with which that decision was? It was obviously always going to be on the cards.
Yeah.
It was something he would move towards.
That's
but I don't
right.
think anybody was really expecting that announcement that quickly and that time frame of 12 months.
Yes, I was surprised. There was a comparison made in the transition, and I think it goes also for the early days of the administration between Obama's and Clinton's in '92, where Clinton had a very messy transition, and the early months of his actual beginning of his term in office were confused and confusing, and he couldn't get his nominees through the Senate committees they have a right to subject them to question and to turn them down. They get right of approval of cabinet level officers. And Clinton's early months were not orderly. In fact, his first 2 years were chaotic. So I think very much the Obama team and Obama wanted to avoid that. So they were ready with that, as you say, just to pump it on people right away. There's that, the stem cell research, other things were sort of spelled out fairly definitely. So I was, and I think a lot of people were pleasantly surprised.
One of the big announcements we're reading about today is the talk of bringing the majority of US troops out of Iraq within a year.
Yeah.
That's counterbalanced by his increase of presence in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Another push there.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's interesting and in some ways worrisome. It worries two different groups. I think what is seen by some people as precipitous withdrawal from Afghanistan, I think shapes up as a conflict possibly between Obama and the military. They see the need. I think I gather it's fairly well established to get out, but whereas they may have an 18-month, he's got a 12-month, or, there is a difference between them, and each is adjusted according to their previous statements and his promises and the general's sense of what's possible. So that's one political issue that'll spill out into politics, not just a military decision. And what the plan is there? What is it supposed to achieve? Can it achieve a stability of the Karzai regime, contain the Taliban, or marginalize them to the point of their extinction? Will 30,000 troops do it? So that's seen, I think, by the left as a potential Vietnam. Both cliches or precedents come roaring back. So there are two big foreign policy issues and military foreign policy issues there.
Because on the face of it, Afghanistan's almost ironic in that it would seem to have been President Bush's war on terror campaign.
Yeah.
And he's picking up that mantle. He's withdrawing from Iraq, but he's pushing
That's
on
right.
in Afghanistan.
And jettisoning some of the explicit war on terror rhetoric, but it does look like a continuation of that.
Do you think it's because they feel they have a better chance of success?
It's hard to know. On the one hand, I hope they think it's winnable and they're not just going in for the symbolic or to make the gesture. It's a big gesture if it is, but again, there must be people around him, including General Petraeus, who know that Afghanistan's been the graveyard of great power hopes for 3 centuries, since the 19th century. So I'm baffled by the heavy emphasis they put on it. Now, there's one other factor that he named George Mitchell to go on a fact-finding mission in Israel and Gaza and Palestine. He named Richard Holbrooke, which has gotten less attention, to handle the Pakistan-Afghanistan theater. Now these are presidential special appointments, not through the State Department, which is Hillary Clinton's bailiwick. But I'm sure it's been clear. But Holbrooke could have been Secretary of State. He's very experienced. He negotiated the Dayton Accords in connection with Bosnia and ex-Yugoslavia. So Clinton's put one of the best people, most respected people on that issue. So that in some ways is reassuring, I think.
That relationship with Hillary Clinton,
obviously
there was a lot of talk about that during the party campaign, but obviously the campaigning is one thing, working together is another. How do you see that relationship faring?
There was evidence before the primaries heated up, the Democratic primaries heated up, that the two got along okay, although there was tensions and there were things said on both sides, both political and non-political, that raised hackles. But I don't think there's probably a personal problem there. They respect each other. Her presidential ambitions probably are not stilled totally. There is the question of Bill Clinton hovering around. There's a question of how much she will be read as speaking for him, Obama, rather than for herself. That is, the theory of secretaries of state is that they have to be seen to have the president's imprimatur, that force behind them for them to be effective. Now, if she's seen as moving away from things he seems to be stressing, it may hurt the foreign policy effectiveness coming from both of them. So I think that's a work in progress. That's a relationship in progress that we don't know how is going to turn out.
Be interesting to watch, though, I'm sure.
I think the other thing there is that her close relation as a former senator from New York State, and that close relation to Israel, and what's come to be known out loud as the Israeli lobby, as well as how the relationship between the Palestinians and Israel proceeds, is very important too. Would she have been named Secretary of State if she differed markedly from Obama in his views? Can she provide cover for him to take steps to depart from traditional U.S. policy? Has she signed on to new departures there? I think that remains to be seen too.
I mean, we've seen with recent events in Gaza, certainly that there would appear to be a need for a change in
Yeah.
America's tactics. It's obviously impossible to say now, but do you think that will be high on their agenda?
I think so. When I was in Washington and reading the Washington Post and New York Times, a lot of stuff still doesn't filter across either in the print media or on the voice media and electronic media. But they were getting reactions from Palestinians and people in the Middle East, and they were very pleased by George Mitchell's appointment. I was surprised at their reaction. Mitchell is Lebanese background. One of his parents Lebanese. He is perceived apparently as more even-handed than most of the U.S. negotiators have been seen to be.
Are you optimistic?
Not particularly. No, but I don't think you can be. But I think if Obama can work the Muslim world more, as he has had a major interview with it's not Al Jazeera, but one of the Arab news outlets. If he works on that, I think it will really help. Paying attention to, rather than just seeing as a problem area, and that we have sort of free hand to decide whether they have democracy or not, but seeing them as real countries with real history. My sense is that I'm in some ways more optimistic about what will happen with Iran. I think, despite that, both sides talk tough when they get these initial communiques. In the paper this morning, it said no deal in sight in Iran, but that's public relations stuff, and I think there perhaps may be a good chance for working out something there.
That's in stark contrast to what actually was an escalating, a ramping up of tensions between Bush's administration and Iran.
Absolutely,
and I'm sure a huge relief to a lot of people. that's
right.
Now been.
Yeah, I think what the Obama regime will want to do is, I suppose, lay off a bit and make conciliatory noises to try to help the forces in Iran who oppose Ahmadinejad in the election coming up. If it can subdue that tension between the U.S. and Iran, and really Israel is the elephant in the room there too, then that may help the more moderate forces in Iran come back into power.
Strangely, from Iran to Alaska now, have we seen the last of Sarah Palin?
Well, in reading, on the web and in the newspaper, she keeps turning up in sort of small things. I think she's had her taste of national attention, and it's tasted good, and she'll probably want to push it a little farther. She's made some fairly conciliatory noises toward the administration, and this brings us, of course, to domestic policy and the economic program, where the states and the state governors of all 50 states stand to be helped very much by a large spending package which will get money to the states to help them pick up some of their functions of, state governments have welfare functions and infrastructure functions and all the things the national government has, but handled at local level that don't have interstate or national consequences. So she, as a state governor, is interested in the Republicans actually supporting Obama's program. Apparently there's a tension between Republican state governors and the Republicans in the Senate and the House in Washington, because
that's going to be productive.
Yeah,
isn't it?
That's right. I hope. Well, the liberal progressive side hopes that the Republican governors can lean on the what really does seem to be a pretty unimaginative and negative reaction to Obama's proposals for this vast spending. It's messy.
Yeah.
Democrats are no angels. They load in measures that look like what in American politics called pork barrel, that is spending for local projects that won't have any stimulus effects. I hope they can strip the egregious examples out and get on with it. But the Republicans, and this is, of course, self-serving, leadership in the Senate saying it doesn't look like the bill will pass right now in the Senate. That's, again, they're sending up flags for saying, negotiate with us, negotiate with us. If they're at all interested in some sort of cooperation, they may just be wanting to stonewall it.
And finally, George Bush Jr., I'm sure his departure has given a lot of Americans reason to breathe a huge sigh of relief. He's obviously stripped the complete comedy circuit of any material that they may have for live stand-ups. But was it as bad?
Was it as
bad? We seem we're led to believe it was.
Well, the judicious reply is to say, well, we'll have to wait and see. It's hard to figure out where major reassessments would come, reassessments upward on Bush. I think a lot of Republicans even may have voted for McCain, but certainly were bothered increasingly by a man who didn't seem to grow in office, didn't seem to after 8 years to pay more attention. Obama's clearly we don't have their IQ test scores, but clearly seems to be brighter and quicker and more intelligent, and the people around him therefore do as well. And I think the big disappointment in the Bush administration was a regime with huge foreign policy experience, in a way like the Reagan years. In the Reagan years, the Republicans' foreign policy team around Reagan really, I have to say, did a good job in managing the end of the Soviet empire. And
they certainly deserved the money they received.
Yeah, Gorbachev's coming to power and encouraging that, not tainting him with too close. And then George Herbert Walker Bush handled it well too. It was a major foreign policy achievement, and I think anybody would have to say that, and historians have said it. But some of the Cheney, Rumsfeld, Powell, they were a huge disappointment in foreign policy terms. All those guys weren't that hard line earlier. So I think that there was a big disappointment there, and something happened. It may have been the context of international terrorism, but that just, because Republicans don't think naturally in terms of domestic policy. They think in terms of reducing the size and the scope of government. So their skill area, their area of expertise tends to be foreign policy and defense policy. And if they mess that up, as I think they did in general, then they have really no legacy to fall back on. I think Bush's leaving has caused problems for Jon Stewart and other comedians.
I was just going to get on to The Daily Show. But,
well, go ahead. I'm a fan, and like most people, and he's trying to find a new role, like everybody else. But it is a kind of microcosmic mirroring of a whole set of people in the country who, as Nixon said when he lost the presidency in 1960. You won't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore. To the journalists saying, go find somebody else to pick on, and what will you now say? In some ways, it may be a kind of vacuum of where do we go to? Who do we blame? Who do we pick on? How do we find the comic side of Obama and his regime? And
do you think the media will be forgiving of him? Because I remember in South Africa when the period of transition came about, you had a media that was confused. Its function was all of a sudden thrown, because prior to that, aside from the right-wing owned newspapers in Johannesburg, journalists were no longer angry. They had nothing to be angry about anymore. They
lose the edge.
They were seen to be wanting to be supportive of the government, obviously, because that's what they fought for. A lot of the journalists were tortured. But at the same time, not give the government an easy ride. Do you think that's a similar sort of parallel? I
do.
Moment?
It's interesting, and it's of course the scope of the change, I think, was greater, must have been greater in South Africa. But yes, I think they're quite parallel. Saw an interesting program on television on the Friday night after the inauguration. Bill Moyers, who's the major liberal progressive commentator, he's on public broadcasting system, and he talked to two radical journalists and activists, and they were saying Roosevelt, the parallels are with Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s, but they say we mustn't forget that Roosevelt got enormous pressure to push through legislation and programs. For instance, the National Labor Relations Act, which was a charter of liberty, the Bill of Rights for labor, Roosevelt didn't support. at first. He didn't initiate it. It was initiated in Congress. So the Congress has got to put pressure on Obama in progressive directions. Movements and groups out in the country have to, that Obama really can't do it by himself. So this turns around not quite what a journalist do, but what does the rest of the country do? And I think you hope that people don't sit back and wait for him, Obama, to work miracles. It needs pressure. Any movement. I mean, Bush needed the same kind of pressure too. So any person in power in a position like the presidency needs pressure from below that will push him or her toward completion of the measures. And Lincoln did this even in the Civil War, said to Frederick Douglass and the other abolitionists, put pressure on me. I can't do this unless I'm seen to have to do it because of pressure from outside. So there is a role for not just journalists, but also the general population.
You've been listening to the University of Nottingham podcast. Some of the music in this show has been supplied by the Podshow Podsafe Music Network. That's music.podshow.com. If you'd like to comment on this or any other podcast you've heard, you can add a message on iTunes or simply drop me a line at andrew.burden@nottingham.ac.uk. Thanks for listening.